Hi everyone. Before we get started, I just have a few announcements. First, registration for George Bright's in-person seminar, Where Did Jung's Red Book Come From and Why Does It Matter?, closes on May 10th. The seminar is on May 17th, but we have to give final numbers to the hotel the week before, so registration closes on May 10th. If you are planning on coming and have not registered, please do so as soon as possible. Also, the recording of Nora Swan Foster's in-person workshop, Image or Art, From Jung's Red Book to Jungian Art Therapy, is now available as a self-study course in our store. So you can just follow the link in the show notes to get to that. Finally, you may notice in your podcast player that the name of the podcast has changed from Jungian Anthology Podcast to Jungian Anthology Radio, as we have more offerings on this feed, and all of those shows have their own names and would like to be called such and such podcast. Jungian Anthology Radio is a way of talking about how Jungian Anthology is kind of a home for several shows, and we'll use that moving forward. All right. Now let's jump right into Season 2 of Jungian Ever After.
Hello and welcome to Season 2, Episode 0 of Jungian Ever After, a podcast about myths and fairy tales through the lens of Jungian analysis. I am your host, Reza, and joining me as always is my co-host and Jungian analyst, Dr. Adina Davidson. It's been a minute.
Yeah, as they say on NPR. Yes, and I notice I'm kind of nervous about starting again, recording again. I also wanted to let people know a little bit about why we've been gone so long. And that's kind of your news to share, so maybe I'll let you share that.
Sure. So my wife and I had a beautiful baby girl in August, and she has been naturally taking up majority of my time. There was a lot of sort of even leading up to that, getting things ready in the house. So, stuff always took longer than we anticipated. And after some of the technical snafus we had, with the show in Season 1, getting set up in the new situation was just taking time. But now my office is built and we are recording there. I've got, my mom was watching the baby for now. She's at this point 4.5 months, so it's a little easier to do that. But we also needed to take some time to flesh out what we were going to do for this next season.
And I'm really, really excited. I'm just excited to be back doing this with you again. I've missed having our shared project and our shared thinking about storytelling and how we feel about storytelling. So yeah, what we're going to be doing with this second season of Jungian Ever After is taking a look at Greek mythology. We spent almost a year on Grimm's fairy tales, and we thought, all right, what's next? And Greek mythology, again, is something that just pulls me for sure, and I know you also, Reza.
Yeah, I did a play in high school of Metamorphosis with my wife, and also just am very deep in Greek mythology from whether it was reading stuff either for class or not for class. I remember watching the Odyssey on, back when they did those specials on Sundays or something, it would go over multiple Sundays. We recorded on VHS, the Odyssey. And I loved that story. I loved the story of Troy and the Iliad. So I may have gone through a few more of these things in sort of movie form than you have, but still always been fascinated by the Greek mythology. So you may have noticed that this is kind of an episode 0 and not 1. And that's because this is going to be sort of a primer on all the Greek gods. So it's not all going to be boring introductions. We have plenty to say when it comes to these characters. But it just sort of felt like, okay, we know all of these, but not everyone, ingrades themselves in all these stories of various mythologies around the world. So, Adina, I think you had something in particular that you wanted to open with regarding this pantheon as a whole of the Greek gods.
Yeah, but even before I get into that, I want to say that I started kind of doing my research for this episode by reading the beginning of the Edith Hamilton book that almost everybody owns on Greek mythology. And it was really helpful to just go through each of the gods one by one and how they were related to each other and what their main characteristics were. And so I really thought it was going to be valuable to share that with our podcast listeners before we start diving into the actual stories that they are the main characters of. So what I wanted to start out was wondering why on earth the Greek gods are so aggravating. They are beautiful. They're immortal. They are also childish and cruel. They're noble and sociopathic, incredibly powerful and incredibly stupid, sometimes wise, etc., etc. Their most consistent characteristic is their inconsistency. And even with all of that inconsistency, they have enormous power over mortals. If the gods decide that humans will dance, we're going to dance. If they decide we're going to make war, no matter how stupid and pointless we know that war to be, we will make war. If they say it's time to make music or poetry or devour our own children, we are going to do those things. How can we understand this?
I've always thought of myths and fairy tales as stories not just for entertainment, but that people would use as explanations for things that either they did not yet understand through science or as some kind of moral instruction. And one thing that stands out for me about the Greco-Roman deities, as opposed to from other pantheons, is that they are true immortals. And yet, they retain such human qualities, perhaps even exaggeratedly so. I think kind of like comic book characters whose superhuman qualities also manifest in superhuman personalities, both for, the heroes and the villains.
Yeah, I think that's a good insight. I think for me, I understand the Greek gods as personifications of archetypal patterns. And that helps me understand both the gods and the archetypal patterns better. The Greek gods often seem nothing like a Jewish, Christian, or Muslim conception of God. They are numinous, but they're filled with all of these human-seeming flaws and limitations. And I wanted to just quote Edith Hamilton here as a partial explanation. She says, "The Greeks did not believe the gods created the universe. It was the other way about. Before there were gods, heaven and earth had been formed. They were the first parents, the Titans were their children, and the gods were their grandchildren."
Yeah, it's not really the story that we're used to hearing, particularly in, any of the three that you mentioned, right? Christianity, Islam, Judaism.
The Abrahamic religions.
Exactly. There, it's so ingrained that, no, God created the universe. And I tried to Google how many mythologies there are in which sort of the deities don't create the universe, but the algorithm immediately turns to very different theological subject matter that was pretty useless for trying to find the answer I was looking for. So, maybe our listeners can inform us of other ones that do this, but the only ones that I personally know of that share this quality are the Irish, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation on this, but Tuatha De Danann, and the Norse Aesir and Vanir. The Tuatha were basically druids, or some various kinds of warriors or things, who transcended normal personhood to become something greater and kind of became gods in that way. So, of course, they couldn't have created the universe because they were people. And then in Norse mythology, Muspel, or Muspelheim, was the first world to exist. And that's the world of light and fire. And then it's a combination of that fire world and a different ice world, that those two things together end up creating life. And it's actually later on that you get to Odin, who, becomes the ruler of heaven and earth. So he's way later in their creation story.
Right. So again, like the Greek gods, there's perhaps a creator in the Irish and the Norse mythology, but there's definitely a natural creation. And then the gods emerge out of that natural creation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this emergence out of nature helps to explain the exasperation I often feel for the Greek gods. They are not the one creator of all, which I, as a Jew, kind of, I think, intuitively expect from a god, right?
Mm-hmm.
I expect God to be the ultimate divine, to be all-powerful and all-knowing. And the Greek gods are not that at all. They can be just, they can be unjust, they can be kind. Frankly, more often, they can be cruel. The gods are created beings who are born out of nature, just like humans. And the understanding that this is the fundamental nature of the Greek gods, understanding that they come from the same source as humans, gives me a basis for viewing the gods as personifications of our archetypal processes or patterns. The gods embody and give story to the deepest human patterns, both our best and often our worst.
And I think that's also true of the other two that I mentioned. It's much easier for these deities to be personifications when they themselves are just sort of magical people. And I kind of wonder if that's why, certainly, Norse and Greek are some of the stories that people do still know today.
That's really interesting. And I think the fact that they do personify these archetypal patterns really gives us a way into understanding the archetypal patterns, because without personification and without story, we don't have any frame. Learning about the Greek gods gives us this mythological lens into the archetypal layer. So, for example, let's take a look at Zeus. Zeus is all-powerful and all-seeing, but he can be opposed and deceived, and quite often is. Fate and death are both stronger than Zeus. And again, this is very different from my understanding of divinity. So, for me, when we study these ancient myths, we get this glimpse into that layer of psyche that we share with all human beings, past, present, and future. We can see what we are striving toward and what shadow may hide behind our glorious goals.
Well, I suppose we can dive right into these characters, since there's actually quite a few of them before we get to the Olympians and Zeus. But it starts with the Titans. So we've got Cronus, who is the ruler of the Titans until Zeus overthrew him. There's the ocean, which is the river that circles the earth. There's Tethys, who is the ocean's wife. Hyperion, the father of the sun, moon, and dawn. Mnemosyne, I think, which is memory. Themis, or Themis, justice. Iapetus, again, I don't know Greek, so some of these are going to be a struggle for me, but who's the father of Atlas, and Atlas, of course, is the one who carries the world on his shoulders. And, of course, Prometheus, the savior of mankind, bringer of fire, who received pretty substantial punishment for his crime, but is pretty much their, I think, apple of knowledge version.
Yeah, so Prometheus stole fire from the realm of the gods and gave it to human beings. And his punishment was to be chained to a rock and have his liver eaten by an eagle, I believe. And it would regrow, and he would have the same punishment day after day after day. So I think Prometheus is probably, if we're going to look at archetypal patterns, an example of the sacrifice for the greater good archetypal pattern, and really a very powerful example of that.
Fire, in this case, of course, represents fire, which is a big deal, but also, I think, innovation.
And I might even say that which separates humans from animals.
Mm-hmm.
That capacity to control fire, to cook our food, really brought us from one level of existence to another. But let's go back to the gods. Most of the gods make their home on Mount Olympus. Even the nature of Mount Olympus itself is unclear. Maybe it's an earthly mountain, but probably not. Homer says about it that there is no wind, rain, or snow, only sunshine. It is the abode of perfect blessing. The gods feast on ambrosia and nectar and listen to Apollo's lyre.
So Mount Olympus is, I think, such an interesting heavenly domain because it's also a real mountain that in modern day, if you are the adventuring sort, you could climb in 2 or 3 days. It's apparently, a challenging climb. The first recorded ascent was in 1913. And it is the highest point in Greece. So one can imagine how it became storied as a place that only the gods could reside. I think the idea that there's no snow up there is a little unlikely. But it's tangible in a way that other heavens simply are not.
I think this whole confusion between whether it is a physical mountain or purely spiritual is another example of the confusing nature of the Greek gods. Olympus, like the gods themselves, is both an ordinary part of creation and simultaneously beyond mortal existence. So it's both created and ordinary and understandable and numinous and beyond understanding and spiritual. Archetypally, mountains tend to be the home of the gods. Moses and the people Israel hear the word of God from Mount Sinai. Muhammad goes to the mountains for his revelation from Allah. Jesus preaches the Sermon on the Mount from a mountain.
Yeah, and I think it's just that thing of it's as close as we can get to any sort of heaven. It's always assumed that it's up above, up in the clouds. So I think there's always just this association of, well, has to be somewhere high. What's somewhere high? That's the mountains. I almost wonder, had people known everything the way we do now, would everyone have just used Mount Everest? Just use the highest point, whatever's going to bring you closest to the heavens.
Yeah. Maybe. I mean, you've done some mountain climbing, probably more than me.
Not that scale.
There is something numinous, something spiritual that I think everyone kind of viscerally feels as you go to the top of a mountain. I'm very comfortable sort of leaving that as a mystery. Why that is that humans feel that way is a mystery. But that we do feel that way, I think, again, is just an example of that archetypal pattern. So let's start on the gods themselves and start with Zeus. Zeus is supreme ruler of the gods, but not because of his merit. He drew lots with his brothers for his share of the universe. He is lord of the sky, the rain god, the cloud gatherer, thunderbolt wielder. He is the most powerful of the gods, But as I said before, he can be opposed and deceived. Fate is sometimes considered stronger than Zeus. His bird is the eagle, and his tree is the oak. Zeus is both a seducer and a rapist and a fool. And he's a powerful god who demands honesty and loyalty in exchange for help. Like most of the Greek gods, he is a complex figure. And again, like all archetypal patterns and all the gods, he has a polarized nature, a low and a high. He can be spiritually noble or earthly, transcendent, foolish, and sometimes even sociopathic. For example, he, quote, falls in love, quote, with one woman after another, and frequently resorts to kidnapping and rape to get what he wants from them. And on the other hand, he requires not just sacrifice, but right action. He only loves those who are loyal and honest.
I think it's pretty safe to say that in sort of modern terms, Zeus is probably one of the least likable in the Greek pantheon. Very different from the cheerful depiction he gets in the Disney Hercules. I think anyone familiar with the stories understands just how awful he can be, and often that really makes you feel for his wife.
And if you're not familiar with the stories, keep listening, because we will be.
We'll get there.
Exactly. Yeah, Zeus is a real son of a bee, and frighteningly powerful at the same time. As my teacher and mentor, Arlo Compan, taught me, it is our job to humanize the archetypal patterns, to integrate and to modulate the raw polarities. I would add to that it is our job to be humanly and ordinarily decent. So we all carry all the archetypes, including this Zeus archetype, but we need to be careful of the direct flows of archetypal light and darkness. The myths really give us a sense of how bad that can be when we just live in the archetypal. Archetypal energy heals, but it can also rend or destroy. The stories of the gods help us understand our own tendencies, and it is up to us to humanize and embody those tendencies. The archetype of Zeus, in all of his terrifying unlikability, really brings home the necessity of human ethics to tame the archetypal patterns in all of us.
Yeah. Not my favorite character. Father of a couple of characters I like, naturally. But I said, makes you feel for his wife. Well, next on the list, we have Hera, who is both wife and sister of Zeus. That's kind of just how it went down they're all children of the Titans. She is the protector of marriage and married women, which
describes both of us.
Yeah, has a hard time, I think, with that in her own marriage. Most myths have her punishing women that Zeus has seduced or raped, and she always holds a grudge. Her daughter, Ilithia, is the protector of women in childbirth specifically, and the cow and peacock are her animals. So I always felt it's kind of uncomfortable that she punishes the women that Zeus seduced, basically because she can't punish Zeus.
So. I think that's exactly right. And I actually think that's an archetypal pattern, that when people cannot actually get justice or hit back at their oppressor, there's this tendency to punch down.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you have to do something with the anger, and so you take it out on the victim.
Which, unfortunately, is, all too common in...
It's an archetypal pattern. We can see it happening over and over again.
So next we have Poseidon, who is brother of Zeus, ruler of the seas. Greeks were sailors, so Poseidon was very crucial to their lives. He gave the first horses to humans and commands both storms and calm at sea. He's also called the Earth Shaker, and his trident causes earthquakes, which I don't know if tidal waves were like a thing that happened a lot, but
it would have been for sure, because there were a lot of earthquakes in Greece. So when there's an earthquake under the ocean, you're going to get a tidal wave, I think.
Certainly sometimes. Although I guess most of it would have been the Aegean Sea, right?
Right, which is a fairly calm sea, I think. Okay, you've come to the end of Adina and Resa's knowledge of either geography or geology. Sorry, guys.
I guess that would be weather. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, so very important because they did a lot of sailing around the Aegean. Third of the brothers is Hades, brother of Zeus and Poseidon. His helmet causes invisibility, and generally he stays in the land of the dead, which is also called Hades, and he is without pity and inexorable, but just. So he's king of the dead, but Thanatos is actually death itself. Thanatos is a different god. But what I find interesting is oftentimes Hades is depicted as not a great guy. And I think that really is because of the influence of sort of Christianity and their perceptions of an underworld that is hell. Mm-hmm. But that's not really what Hades is. Hades encompasses the entirety of the underworld, but that is then broken down into 3 segments that I'm sure will come up later. But we've got Tartarus, where all the punishment happens. That's where our buddy Prometheus is receiving that eternal punishment. You've heard of a Sisyphusian task. Sisyphus also is punished and is in Tartarus. Then you've got in between, there's Asphodel, that I don't know as much about. I think of it as kind of a purgatory.
Yeah, neither terrible nor wonderful, I think.
And then there is Elysium, which is heaven and the place for, brave warriors and all of that. So you have all of these things under one name that is Hades, and the river Styx flows through all of it.
So I often think that it's a shame that instead of calling it the underworld, with all of our associations of things that are worse are lower, right? If we could just call it the other world.
Yeah.
I think it really changes the whole feel for Hades' realm if we just say it's the other world. And that's how I tend to think of it in my head.
Or the afterlife or something, right?
Or, in my faith tradition, it's called the Olam Haba, the world to come. Mm. But yeah, I think it's really important to know Hades is not, in Greek mythology, is not evil.
Right.
At all. In fact, he's really much less evil than Zeus or Hera.
Yeah.
Hades is neutral.
Which is, again, I hate to go back to the Disney every time, but this is what people get so much exposure to, right? In Disney's Hercules, Hades, definitely evil. Sends little servants to go ruin Hercules' immortality, and that's why he's a demigod instead of a god. And there's, I think, even a part of Once Upon a Time, which we love so much, that involves Hades, and he's a little more on the not great side, So I think it's just very common to depict him in that way because people have such negative feelings about death, about the afterlife, and not necessarily knowing that Elysium's down there too.
Yeah, in Greek mythology, yes, he has no pity. He is inexorable. You cannot avoid going to the other world. But he's also just. And again, that's not a particularly common trait among the gods. Justice is not their strongest suit. Our next goddess is Pallas Athena. She's the daughter of Zeus, and she has no mother. She sprang from Zeus's head, full grown and in full armor. So she never had a babyhood. She was never nurtured. And she is a fierce battle goddess. She's defender of her state and her home. She's the goddess of the city, the protector of civilized life, of crafts and agriculture. So in the way that Poseidon is really a god of kind of raw nature, Athena is really a god of civilization. She invented the bridle and tamed horses for human use. She's Zeus's favorite child. She carries his weapons, and she is the embodiment of wisdom, reason, and purity. Athens is her city, olives are her fruit, and the owl is her bird. And she tends to be a pretty positive goddess in most of the stories.
Yeah, I think she is, I believe, one of the people who supports Perseus in his quest in various ways. Might be misremembering that. But I think Odysseus also very much loved Athena.
And her city, Athens, she always protects.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, and I know my dad loved owls, and the owl being Athena's bird. I think he also, in some of these things that we would watch, he definitely liked
had a soft spot for her.
For Athena, definitely, yeah. So next is one that I definitely loved growing up, and that is Phoebus Apollo, who is son of Zeus and Leto, master musician, archer, healer, and the god of light and truth. No darkness and no deceit. Delphi is the home of his oracle, and truth seekers will go to Delphi. He's called Pythian because he killed a great python with his arrows, and Phoebus, that sort of part before his name, means brilliant or shining. He's almost purely beneficent. He's kind of a link between gods and humans, shows humans how to make peace with the gods, and purifies humans of sin. The laurel is his tree, and dolphins and crows are his animals. Occasionally, he can be portrayed as pitiless and cruel.
And maybe a little bit of Apollo's shadow is that he has no patience with darkness.
Mm-hmm.
You can only go to Apollo with light and with joy.
Not a lot of room for redemption.
Yes, right, exactly. Or you have to go to another god. You have to go to another archetypal pattern to work with darkness or sadness.
Yeah, and I think I sort of was drawn to Apollo as a kid because I very much had that truth and, I'm saying when I was a young kid, truth and light, and, my first character that I played in Dungeons & Dragons was a paladin who are lawful good, very follow the rules. And also, I liked archery and that kind of thing.
I mean, I think Apollo is a wonderful archetypal pattern. It's just one-sided.
Mm-hmm.
So if we go to the next one, we're going to see somebody not so light, Artemis, who's actually Apollo's twin sister. And I think, again, that's a lovely personification of archetypal patterns where light and darkness are almost always paired.
Mm-hmm.
So Artemis is the lady of wild things. She is preserver of the young, but she is fierce and vengeful. Even as she is the protector of maidens, she demands the human sacrifice of a maiden to allow the Greek fleet to sail to Troy. The shadow of her protection of youth and innocence is her willingness to sacrifice the young and vulnerable. An example of this archetypal pattern in the present day are laws that are designed to protect children's innocence, but sacrifice the well-being of the most vulnerable children, minorities, marginalized people, people in the LGBT community. More personally, I can feel the Artemis archetypal pattern in the love, tenderness, and protection I felt for my own very young children, and that could shift with this kind of shocking suddenness to irritation and even fury. The restraint to not act on that darker, rageful Artemis energy is an example of what I mean by humanizing the archetypes.
Any parent who's got kids on the playground with other kids and someone hits, even accidentally, your child, right? And you have to hold yourself back and remember that they are also a child. You cannot flare up against them. So I actually also liked Artemis. I might have just had a preference for archery in general. They're both great archers, and I love archery. There was always something about bows that to me felt more refined than guns. But I think also it's that wild side, that beauty and freedom. And admittedly, I didn't remember that it was her that demanded that sacrifice at Troy. That does not go so great for the king who does that.
No. I hope we will get to that story because it's really an important one. But I do think that pairing of the restraint of Apollo with the wildness of Artemis, again, gives us a feel for the way archetypal patterns are always two-sided. So Apollo is the sun, Artemis is the moon. She's the goddess with three forms: Selene, the moon in the sky, Artemis on earth, and Hecate in the underworld. Hecate is the goddess of the dark of the moon, those black nights with no moon at all. She's also the goddess of the crossroads, which were believed to be where ghosts and evil magic lived. Artemis embodies the dichotomy between good and evil like the other gods. All of the wild animals belong to Artemis, but particularly deer.
Well, that then takes us to another goddess, Aphrodite, who I think everyone knows as goddess of love and beauty. The gods and humans adore her. She loves laughter and has little patience for tears. She can steal the wits of even the wise, and she arose from sea foam. Wind and storms flee from her, and where she steps, sweet flowers bloom. She moves in radiant light. She is the source of joy and beauty, and sometimes also portrayed as soft and weak, or treacherous and malicious. She is the wife of Hephaestus, the smith, who is notably the only lame and ugly of the deities. He's the god of the forge. I think it's also of note that punishment from Aphrodite can be very cruel.
And totally unfair, right? Completely without any justice, or totally out of proportion to whatever the crime or really mistake may have been.
It may be something such as saying, "You'll never fall in love," right? Which would be an insult to her.
Gotta watch out for Aphrodite. Hermes is much more clearly somebody to be cautious of. He is the messenger of the gods. He wears winged sandals on his feet and a winged hat on his head. He is one of the gods of civilization, like Athena, rather than raw nature, like Artemis. He is the patron god of all healers, and he holds the healing staff, the caduceus. Hermes created the first way to make music that wasn't just simply singing or banging on a surface. He created the lyre, and he is the god of commerce and trade. He's also the ultimate trickster. He's shrewd and cunning and a master thief. On the day of his birth, he stole Apollo's sheep. Finally, he is the god who guides the dead home.
So Hermes is also called Mercury in the Roman. And for me, that's a little personal because Hermes is depicted in some myths and statuary as either sort of a hermaphrodite or just otherwise expansive gender-wise, I would say. And I kind of like to think about how the metal, mercury, is liquid at room temperature, unlike most metals. So too is, Mercury's or Hermes' gender. A bit fluid. Yeah.
It's also worth noting that Mercurius is a necessary part of the alchemical transition of lead into gold. Mercurius's trickster energy and unpredictability causes changes in inert substances, and those substances can be physical, psychological, or social.
Well, that takes us to a more directly adversarial god,
really the darkest god in the Pantheon is Ares. Ares is the god of war. He was hated by both his parents, Zeus and Hera. Homer calls him murderous, blood-stained, the incarnate curse of mortals. And strangely, he's a coward also. He runs away when he's wounded. Ares is perhaps the most purely negative god and the most negative personification of archetypal power. He's a classic bully. He's cruel to those weaker than himself, and he's terrified when he gets some of his own medicine back. His story also gives insight into the archetypal pattern of bullying and sociopathy. Bullies and sociopaths almost always have been deeply unloved as young children, in the same way that Ares was hated by his parents. This early abandonment and rejection, and often abuse, then in turn gets acted out on those weaker than the bully or the sociopath. Often the victims of sociopaths are the forgotten and most vulnerable members of society. Where there is no loving care from parents, there will be rage, violence, and callousness to the suffering of others. It is our parents' love that teaches us to love ourselves and others. Ares shows us what archetypally tends to happen when love is absent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that domain, God of War, hard to really have a positive deity out of all that.
Although, as we said when we were kind of talking about this show, the Romans really thought that Mars, which is what they called Ares, was pretty great. And war functioned tremendously to the benefit of Rome and Romans.
I mean, they were really about the business of empire. So, I mean, that pretty much tracks. I don't think that makes him a positive deity. It just means that they appreciated his...
the benefits to them.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, fair point.
Yeah. He's also the villain in Wonder Woman, if you remember.
No, I totally forgot that.
Sort of, the idea is like, oh, all this stuff behind I think it was World War I, actually, possibly, was the machinations of Ares. So that's, yeah, sorry, spoilers for Wonder Woman, the first one.
Which you should really see if you haven't seen it already.
So that brings us to one we mentioned earlier, Hephaestus, the only ugly immortal. He also became lame when he was cast out of Olympus for trying to defend Hera, his mother. What a thing to be cast out for. This expulsion didn't last long. Hephaestus is an honored resident of Olympus, and he is the working man of the gods. The gods depend on him to make their armor, furnishings, weapons, and other products of the forge. Hephaestus is often portrayed as married to Aphrodite, thus creating the polarities of beauty and ugliness. Aphrodite's treachery and malice with Hephaestus's loyalty and kindness. Aphrodite's soft weakness with Hephaestus's physical strength. Hephaestus is one of the few kind and peace-loving gods. He is the patron of handicrafts and arts. I really should be a worshiper of Hephaestus.
Yeah, I mean, I think any craftsman is paying honor to that archetypal pattern, to that kind of out of hard work comes things of use and beauty. One of the last of the gods is Hestia. Hestia has no myth or personality. She is the goddess of the hearth and the symbol of home. She's the center of the center. She's always given offerings before and after meals, very much like grace that both Jews and Christians will do. Every city has a public hearth that is sacred to Hestia. If a new town was founded, coals would be taken from Hestia's hearth in the old town to start a new fire in the new city. I personally love Hestia and feel a very deep connection to her. I have a paper that I wrote during analytic training on Hestia that Raisa and I will post to the Discord if people are interested in seeing it.
So next up, we have the earth gods, which begins with Gaia, the Great Mother, encompasses all of Earth and all the beings on Earth. We are all part of her, and she's not really personified and has no story, but is the beginning of everything. And then, along with Gaia, we have Demeter, goddess of corn and agriculture. She is the source of the harvest and embodies the seasons. She's also the mother of Persephone, and the only god where parenthood is really central to her story, which is kind of sad.
It is, but the story of Demeter and Persephone is so rich, and I cannot wait to dive into that one with you.
Yeah, definitely one of the top stories. We also have Dionysus, god of the vine. Religious ecstasy, poetry, and madness are all part of Dionysus. He can bring joy and gladness or rending destruction. It's the archetype of mind-altering substances and addiction. So not just wine, but, I don't know, I guess shrooms would fall under that. I don't know how much that was.
I think any mind-altering substance, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what hallucinogens the Greeks had access to besides alcohol, but I bet they did.
Probably. I imagine the oracle was on something. Actually, weren't there like vapors at the top of that mountain?
Yeah. Yes. There were yes.
Yeah. So there's definitely some high highs and low lows with Dionysus and his servants, the Maenads.
Mm-hmm.
They are terrifying in terms of the havoc they wreak in their revelry. There are also a few lesser gods worth mentioning, starting with Eros. Plato says of Eros, he makes his home in men's hearts, but not in every heart, for where there is hardness, he departs. And Eros is also translates to love. So Eros, I think, would be the closest to, what people know with Cupid.
Yeah, although Cupid is sort of this fluffy... And Eros is really love in all its complexity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, again, has a shadow side. And Eros isn't safe. Necessary to really be human, but not safe.
Yeah. And of course, the root of erotic, right?
Right, so sexuality. Yeah. But I think sexuality is one aspect of Eros, but Eros is connection. Eros is that which binds us to each other. Intimacy. Plato says of Eros, all men serve him of their own free will, and he whom love touches walks not in darkness. But other people have different views of Eros.
So sometimes Aphrodite's companion, of course, to do with love, and perhaps portrayed as her son. But there's a polarity to Plato's view is when Eros is mischievous or even evil, he can play cruelly with the hearts of humans and is a liar. So I think we've all been hurt by love, right? At some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think love is that which makes life worth living, but it can also make us want to die. I mean, it can hurt more than anything.
And he's also represented as blindfolded because love is blind, right? Very different than justice blindfold. Next up we have, I think it's just Hebe, who is a goddess of youth and cupbearer to the gods, where they're just drinking ambrosia, right? And Iris, the goddess of rainbows, one other messenger of the gods, I guess when Hermes is busy. And then Pan, who is Hermes' son. He is noisy, happy, and part goat. He is the companion to woodland nymphs, and his home is in the wild places. He is the inventor of panpipes, and he is also the creator of panic or terror of the woods at night. So the word pandemonium, and relating to the part goat thing, there are some of these other fantastical creatures worth mentioning. Satyrs are basically goat men, dryads, tree nymphs, centaurs, half man, half horse. They're wild and savage, except for Chiron, who is wise and teaches the healing arts to humans. He was also the teacher of Achilles. And then there are the Fates, Clotho the spinner, Lachesis, who assigns our destiny, and Atropos, who carries the shears and cuts the thread of our life.
And that's not the entire Pantheon, but it's a lot of it, and probably quite enough for today. And I hope it gave everybody a bit of a feel for how Greek mythology puts a face and a name onto archetypal patterns.
I'm sure some of you listening may have already known some or all of these, but it just felt like there's so much there that we had to do some kind of
overview.
Yeah, just like how long fantasy books will have, an appendix of
like a genealogy
here's the
at the
characters.
beginning of the...
Yeah. It just seemed necessary. And we'll be getting to our stories, where I'll be reading like we did before, a little bit different since it's not as straightforward to get copyright-free versions of these stories as with Brothers Grimm. So we are going to be using the Edith Hamilton for a lot of them. It's in public domain. Everyone knows it. It's not necessarily the best.
It's not the best translation, and she very much has her own opinions that come into the story, but it's, not bad either, I don't think.
Well, that's going to do it for today's episode. Our intro-outro music is a sample of Seculos Epitaph with the Lyre of Apollo by Lina Palera under an attribution non-commercial share-alike 3.0 international license. You can find the full version at freemusicarchive.org, link in the show notes. And if you like what you've been hearing, please leave us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your podcast feed of choice, as it really helps other people find the show. This show will always be free and available to all, but if you would like to monetarily support the show, you can do so at ko-fi.com/Jungian Ever After. Also, Dr. Adina Davidson is a certified Jungian analyst who offers telesessions. You can find out more about her practice at adinadavidson.com or her Psychology Today profile. We'll be with you again next month, but until then, we hope your month is filled with exploring the worlds of imagination and storytelling.